Why can't women become priests?
1-833-288-EWTN.
I don't understand why I have to earn salvation.
1-833-288-3986.
What's stopping?
Why do I need to confess my sins to a priest?
What's stopping you? This is Called to Communion with Dr. David Anders on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Call to Communion here on EWTN. This is the program for our non-Catholic brothers and sisters. If you've got a question about the Catholic faith, you're looking around for the answer, let us help. Here's our phone number, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. If you're listening to us outside of North America, you will want to dial the U.S. country code, the number 1, and then 205-271-2985. And, of course, you can always send us an email. We'll get to one of those in a second here. The address ctc@ewtn.com. Charles Beery is our producer. Matt Kabinski, our phone screener. Jeff Burson handles social media for us. If you want to ask a question via YouTube or Facebook, we are streaming there right now. All you have to do is put your question in the comments box. Jeff will see that. He'll send it to us here in the studio, and we will take it from there. I'm Tom Price. Very glad to be back with Dr. David Anders.
Tom, how are you today?
Doing great. How are you, my friend?
I'm doing decent, thank you.
You had a great week in Indianapolis.
I did have a great week in Indianapolis with Catholic Radio Indy up there. Wonderful time. Great folks.
They are great folks. I was blessed to have a week with my sweetheart. We visited friends and family we went to visit her 90-year-old godmother in Nashville. That was a treat.
Very nice.
Yep. Visited some friends on the way up to the Cincinnati area. Saw family. Just a great time to get away.
It's good to be back with you, however.
Great to be back with you. Here is an email that we received from Gina. She says, I understand that God in the end will triumph, but how are we to pray with hope if the overall spiritual condition of souls is not improving through the ages?
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate the question. Well, first of all, the theological virtue of hope is oriented towards eternity and it's the question of our own salvation. And the Church has effectively made saints and more of them down through the centuries. And so I think it's doing its job, and that gives us hope. It encourages us that, yes, you too can become a saint. All you have to do is want to do and follow Christ and live a sacramental life, and you can come to sanctity. So that's the ground, that's the warrant for our hope in eternal life and sanctity in the Catholic Church. But I would also challenge the characterization that society at large has been largely unaffected by the presence of the Catholic Church through history. I don't think that's true at all. I think the Catholic Church has had a profound impact on the social life of humanity for 2,000 years. And all you have to do is read some history and compare cultural attitudes in, say, the first century to what we have today. And while people as individuals continue to be corrupt and sinful and lustful and proud, societies in general across the planet have a much greater respect for things like the principle of human dignity and the incorporation and rehabilitation of the marginalized. I mean, these are commonly accepted values. They are Christian values that did not exist before Christ brought them into the world.
Very good. Gina, thanks so much for your email. Here's one from Katie. How will non-Christians and non-Catholics be judged?
Same way Catholics will be judged, by their works.
That's it.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Katie, for your email. Here's one now from Matthew. How did the early reformers view the relationship between faith and reason?
That is a fabulous question that I deeply appreciate. So, not the way Catholics view it.
Really?
I'll put it that way, right? And they're not all exactly the same. So Lutherans and Calvinists aren't identical, and Anabaptists and Zwinglians and Anglicans, they don't all have the exact same view. But in general, the Protestant reformers took a very dim view about human reason's ability to attain to God or to anything about the life of religion or faith or morality. So they would have recognized that reason has a function in human life. It can govern civil society and maybe make discoveries about the natural world, but they thought it was more or less impotent in the moral and religious realm. And that's not the Catholic Church's position. The Catholic Church's position is that there are a lot of things that we can know about God, about the moral life, about the condition of the human race spiritually from natural reason. And in fact, it's because we can do that the presentation of the gospel is intelligible to us. When someone comes and says, God loves you, he has a plan for your life, here's the plan of salvation in Christ, the language about God makes sense because we can relate it to things that we know in this world. And the idea of God is not absurd. It's not unintelligible when you understand things like the nature of causation. There has to be a first cause, that sort of thing. So Luther took a particularly dim view about the role of reason in religious life. He once said the whole of Aristotle is to the gospel like darkness to light. He called reason a whore and the worst enemy of truth, and himself often took an irrationalist position when, in his book, The Bondage of the Will, which he wrote in 1525, he recognized that some of the positions he was arguing for would strike people as absurd, and his response to that, well, then so be it. That human reason can't fathom the things of God, and if what God asks of us strikes us as absurd, well, then so much the worse for reason. Very different from the Catholic Church's position, which is that reason and the faith can never contradict one another, and you always have to work for that reconciliation.
And we appreciate that. Matthew, thanks for your email. We'll close with this one for now. Dr. Anders, why is the Holy Catholic Church no longer named or referred to as the Holy Roman Catholic Church by current church literature, Catholic Church clergy, or others associated with the Catholic religion?
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate it. Well, we do refer to the Roman Catholic Church, and I use that terminology often, but there's a sense in which Roman Catholic names a rite within the Catholic Church. We have 22 or so sui juris Eastern Rite churches that, while they're in communion with the Pope, they don't fall under the Roman Rite. So they have different liturgy, different canon law, different customs and traditions, and they're fully Catholic, but they're not Roman Catholic. They're Byzantine Catholic or Coptic Catholic or Syro-Malabar Catholic. And so since we really want to name the universality of the Church in all of its liturgical, ethnic, cultural, historical diversity, Catholic gets the job done, whereas Roman Catholic, well, sometimes might lead a person to just think in terms of the Roman Rite. Very good. And Steve, thanks so much for your email as well. If you would like to send us an email for a future show, we're waiting to get it at ctc@ewtn.com, ctc@ewtn.com. In a moment, we'll get to the phones here. We're waiting for your phone call at 833-288-EWTN. If you have a question for Dr. David Anders, 833-288-3986. Call to communion on this beautiful Tuesday afternoon here on EWTN. Stay with us.
If it's central to the faith, you can find it on EWTN Podcast Central, featuring the best of EWTN radio, as well as faith-filled podcasts from our friends and affiliates across the nation, all in one place, all free. The destination for great Catholic audio programming is EWTN Podcast Central. It's like podcast heaven. Visit EWTN.com/radio/podcast today.
Hello, this is Janet Morena of Priest for Life with Pro-Life Update. June 24th is the feast of the birth of John the Baptizer, who leaped for joy in the womb of Elizabeth because of the coming of Christ. John told the people to prepare for Christ's coming by repenting of their sins and continue to preach that message of repentance to those in power, such as when he told King Herod that it was wrong for him to have his brother's wife. John is an example for us to speak the truth boldly. Being a prophet is not primarily about telling the future, but about telling the present, pointing out what God thinks of what is happening now and what he wants us to do about it. As we honor John the Baptizer, then, let us resolve to boldly proclaim the right to life for all, including the unborn. This is Janet Morana on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
Hey, it's Call to Communion on this Tuesday afternoon here on EWTN. Love to hear from you today. We have 3 lines open at the early point of the show here. 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. We'll get to Stephanie in just a moment here. Wonderful new book now available from EWTN Publishing, Father Benedict Answers Your Questions by Father Benedict Goschel. He tackles an array of personal questions in his refreshingly frank, conversational way, addressing everything from hot-button topics in the church to ways to explain what Catholics believe, all the way to advice on increasing your devotion to our Eucharistic Lord. Some of the things talked about in this book: how best to approach forgiveness of others, forgiveness of self. Also, how you can help restore reverence and awe at Mass, and also depression and fruitful ways to combat depression. This is a wonderful resource and a real gift to the Church. A great new book available from EWTN Publishing, Father Benedict Answers Your Questions by Father Benedict Groeschel. It's available right now at EWTNRC.com. Buy Catholic, shop Catholic. EWTNRC.com. If you're ready now, let's go to the phones at 833-288-EWTN. We begin with Stephanie in Centerville, Ohio, listening on the great Sacred Heart Radio. Hey, Stephanie, what's on your mind today?
Yes, good afternoon. I just had a question in regards to when we say that Jesus descended into hell and then on the third day he rose again and ascended into heaven. What was he doing in that 3-day period? What was the purpose of that?
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate the question. So in Scripture, 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 19 speaks about Christ being put to death and descending to the dead and speaking to the spirits who were in prison. And the tradition of the Church is that Christ went to the abode of the dead to liberate the righteous dead of the Old Covenant, Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Moses and the prophets and so forth, who would not have experienced the beatific vision until the ascension of Christ, but were waiting for the coming of the Messiah, like all of us.
Okay. Hey, Stephanie, thank you so much for your call. That opens up a line for you right now at 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Let's go to the other Sacred Heart Radio, this one in Washington State, talking with Steve today. Hey, Steve, what's on your mind today, sir?
Yes, good morning. So last week, Dr. Anders was talking to somebody, and he stated that Thomas Aquinas believed that if the sacrifice of the Mass was performed when Jesus was in the tomb, that the disciples would only have received the body and blood,
Nope.
not the soul.
Well,
And
body, blood, and divinity. Body, blood, and divinity.
Okay, correct.
But
Okay,
not
thank
the
you for
human
the-
soul. Correct, not the human soul.
Okay, so then that might answer my question, because if the soul animates the body and the blood, and if the divinity was missing, then the grace could certainly not have been obtained if the divinity was missing. Is that correct? Maybe that's my misunderstanding.
So Thomas's position was at that time, and of course the apostles did not in fact offer Mass when Christ was in the tomb, not as far as we know. But if they had, his position was, you would have had in the sacred host, you would have had body, blood, and divinity. Body, blood, and divinity. But you would not have had Christ's human soul, because a soul and body were separated. That's what death means, and Christ's human soul had descended to the dead. Now, the divinity of Christ is conjoined hypostatically to his person, not to a particular body part, and so the soul that descended to the dead was also soul and divinity, just as the body and blood that were in the tomb were body, blood, and divinity. But that's what he postulates would have been in the Blessed Sacrament. Now, I often refer to this passage in Thomas because it's not just an historical curiosity about, what would have happened if. There is actually a catechetical takeaway about the nature of Christ's presence in the sacrament. There are a lot of people, mistakenly in my judgment, that believe that what is made present on the altar is Christ somehow mystically as he was present at Calvary. And I've heard people say that a lot. I've actually heard individual Catholics make the claim that the Mass is a kind of time travel by connecting Calvary to the present, and that somehow the bleeding Christ on the cross is brought into the sacrament. I've also heard Catholics claim that Christ as he was in the upper room is made present in the Mass, so that the Jesus you're receiving today is somehow drawn out of the past, as it were. And that's not the Catholic doctrine. The Catholic doctrine is that the Christ who's present in the Blessed Sacrament isn't hijacked from some frozen moment in past time. It's rather Christ as he is right now in his proper person. So Christ currently reigning at the right hand of God in heaven, who's made present on the altar. And and if we were to offer Mass yesterday, it would have been Jesus yesterday who was in the Blessed Sacrament, and hence Christ, the Christ in the Blessed Sacrament on Holy Thursday was the very same Christ who was seated at the table with the apostles. Had they offered Mass on Holy Saturday, it would have been the same Christ who at that time had descended to the dead. If they offered Mass before the Ascension, it would have been the same Christ that was walking and talking with them on earth. Today, when priests offer Mass, when the Church offers Mass, it is Christ as he's presently seated in heaven. So the Mass, in that sense, is not a form of time travel, but it does connect heaven and earth because the humanity of Christ is, in fact, in heaven. That's the way in which it's connecting heaven and earth. People often want to make the claim that the Mass is a timeless reality because God is outside of time. And that's also not precisely true. The Church doesn't teach that except as a kind of metaphor. Because Jesus' presence is temporal in the Blessed Sacrament. He has flesh and blood. He's a human being, and there is passage of time. So that's why I make the point, because it illustrates clearly the nature of Christ's presence that we're talking about when we discuss the Eucharist.
Steve, does that clarify it for you, sir?
Yes, it does somewhat, but then is it dogmatic that it is the body, blood, soul, and divinity that we receive?
Oh, yeah, because see, now Christ is whole and entire. So what St. Thomas says is that the sacrament is, as he puts it, properly the sacrament of body and blood. So that's the language that the priests use. This is my body. This is the blood of the new covenant in my blood, or the cup of the new covenant in my blood. But wherever you get Christ's body and blood, you also get soul and divinity along for the ride. The technical word for that is concomitance. It's just a technical way of saying they come along for the ride. Where you have the one, you have the other. Wherever you have body and blood, you also have soul and divinity now, because Christ is whole and entire. He's the integral Christ.
And what a great ride it is. Steve, thanks so much for your call. Call to Communion here on EWTN. Couple lines open for you at 833-288-EWTN. Perhaps you have a question for Dr. David Anders about the Catholic faith, or maybe you'd like to explain to us what is stopping you from becoming a Catholic. In any event, the phone number is 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Steve, listening in Melbourne, Florida on the great Divine Mercy Radio. Hey, Steve, what's on your mind today, sir?
Hello. Good afternoon. Dr. Anders, we are taught as Catholics not to judge. Even in the face of what we might consider a mortal sin, we don't know what drives that person. Only God does, and whether it qualifies as a mortal sin or not. At least that's what I believe we're taught. And so when you see, like St. John the Baptist celebrated today, that he judges Herod and condemns Herod for his actions, or any other saints or prophets, etc., that pass condemnation or judgment in the Bible, how are we supposed to? Are they allowed, or is it okay for them to pass judgment because of their position, et cetera?
Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate the question. I think the confusion here is due to an ambiguity about the sense in which we take the word judgment, because judgment can be taken in many different senses. Philosophically, we can talk about a judgment, which is just a proposition that I articulate about the reality of a thing. Like this apple is red. That's forming a judgment about the apple. It's not a criticism of the apple. It's not derogatory to appleness, but it is technically a judgment. I'm making a determination of fact. And when it comes to the questions of the moral life, not only are we allowed to judge, we are required to make judgments. And that can include judgments about other people's objective behavior. So, for example, in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, St. Paul deals with a question of scandal in the Corinthian church. A man was with his stepmother in an illicit relationship, And Paul demands that the Corinthians kick the guy out of the church excommunicate him until he comes to his senses. And at the tail end of the chapter, he says, I'm telling you not to do I'm telling you to do these things and stay away from these people and associate with these other people and make sure you punish these other folks. But I'm not talking about those that are outside the Catholic Church. I'm talking about people that are inside the Catholic Church. And he says this. He says, what business is it of mine to judge those outside the church? Are you not to judge those inside? God will judge those outside, but you expel the wicked person from among you.
Okay.
And so here's a different sense of judgment. In this sense, it is the judicial verdict and the imposition of a penalty or a sanction. And the Scripture says, and Jesus says this too, it is imperative that the church does this. So in Matthew chapter 18, Christ says, hey, if somebody sins, you have to go confront them. If they don't listen to you, you take another person. If they don't listen to that guy, you take it to the church. If he doesn't listen to the church, you excommunicate him. So Christ also demands that a judicial verdict be rendered against people who are engaged in scandalous behavior in the church, and the penalty can be up to and including the penalty of excommunication. And it's for the sake of their own soul, as well as for the sake of the body of Christ, that it not cause scandal. And he says, but you don't do that for people outside the church, because, like, who are they to listen to you? And God's going to take care of them. Just you worry about the internal affairs of the church. That's why, there's a big controversy over whether bishops should rebuke Catholic politicians for their public stances. But no one thinks Catholic bishops should run around rebuking non-Catholic politicians, except in a very general way to advocate the goods of the moral life.
Sure.
But then there's a third sense I think we can talk about judgment, and this is really what people mean by judgmentalism. And I believe that within the context of Jesus' own ministry, it's fairly obvious what he was talking about. He was concerned about a form of religious life in which you are hyper-focused on, as he put it, tithing, mint, dill, and cumin, but you neglect the weightier matters of the law, like love and justice and mercy. And, of course, Christ himself exemplified this in the many quote-unquote sinners with whom he associated, right? He would eat with tax collectors and prostitutes and adulterous women and folks that would seem to cause scandal that the community looked down on. And Jesus's sort of consistent demeanor was that, in his point of view, those people weren't the problem. The problem were the religious hypocrites who were filled with pride and self-assertion and self-love and greed, who didn't care a fig for their neighbors, but put on a show of religious superiority because they maintained the rituals and the purity traditions. And that, I think it's very easy to identify that when we see it. We're not living in first century Judea, but all of us encounter those kinds of people. We've probably been that kind of person at some point of our life, and that's where compassion comes in, rather than a kind of fundamentalist legalism.
Hope that clarifies it for you, Steve. Thank you so much for your call. Call to Communion here on EWTN. Let's go to David in Central Florida, listening on Sirius XM, Channel 130. David, what's on your mind today, sir?
Hi, thanks for taking my call, Dr. Anders. Good to talk to you. I had a conversation with my priest, and I was struggling with the difference between substance and accidents, and he explained it this way. I thought it was a good analogy and wanted to run it by you. He said a doorway or a door is a part of the wall that's movable so that you can pass through it, and that's the substance of a door. Its accidents are wood or glass or metal, whatever that door is made out of, and that kind of clicked with me. I just wanted to put that out there to you. I had another part, but I think I've worked through it myself since I was on hold.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks. So the Latin substantia, from which we get the English word substance, and the Greek word ousia, from which we get the word essence, are basically synonymous when it comes to this philosophical question. Substance or essence is whatever it is that makes a certain thing to be the kind of thing that it is. So when you, for example, you used the illustration of doors, I think it's easy to see with species. I have several dogs and cats at my house. I have never been in question about which animal was a dog and which was a cat. I know the difference between a dog and a cat. Whatever it is that makes a dog and a cat, that differentiates the one from the other, is what we mean by substance. But among my particular dogs, their properties are very different. One is big and yellow and stupid and friendly. One is small and black and neurotic and craven. The other one is small, black, and infinitely bold and would take on a garbage truck, right? And so they have very different properties or accidents, but they all have in common that they are dogs, and that thing that makes them all to be dogs, as opposed to the feline members of my family, is what we mean by the word substance.
Great question, great comment there, David. Thank you so much for checking in today in Central Florida. In a moment, we're going to continue with our phone calls, and we would love to hear from you. You can jump into the mix here at 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Or if you'd like to shoot us an email, the address for that, ctc@EWTN.com. Well, let me give you that out-of-the-country phone number one more time if you're listening perhaps in Australia. The number is 1-205-271-2985. Lots more straight ahead on the Tuesday afternoon edition of Call to Communion.
Tomorrow morning on the Sunrise Morning Show.
We will discuss the life and legacy of the great Jesuit St. Aloysius Gonzaga on his feast day. Father Thomas Burt will join us to talk about his new book, Choosing Forgiveness. And Danielle Bean will offer some tips for moms who have a career outside the home. Plus news, weather, sports, and more.
The Sunrise Morning Show, tomorrow at 6 a.m. Eastern on EWTN Radio.
Want to be notified when Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders goes live on Facebook? Follow EWTN Radio's Facebook page and click the bell icon to be notified.
Have you ever heard someone say, "You've got to believe in yourself"? G.K. Chesterton says the people who believe in themselves are all in lunatic asylums. You have to believe in something outside yourself. You have to believe that there's a greater reality than the one inside your head. If the only thing you believe in is yourself, your world will become very small, about the size of a padded cell. We live in a world that rejects the worship of the one true God and has substituted something called the God within. But as Chesterton says, if Jones is told to worship the God within, it ultimately means that Jones shall worship Jones.
Spend more time with the Apostle of Common Sense. Visit chesterton.org for more information and go to EWTNRC.com to discover more books and programs written and inspired by G.K. Chesterton.
Hi, this is Cy Kellett. Later today on Catholic Answers Live, 2 hours of open forum. Joe Heschmeyer, Tim Staples, Catholic Answers Live, 6 p.m. Eastern on EWTN Radio. Now, back to Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders.
Calls are coming in right now for Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders. You could be one of those calls by snagging a line here at 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Jaime in Pennsylvania called in and said, Dr. Anders, for some reason, there are a lot of conspiracy theories out there intertwining about Nephilim, flat Earth, Antarctica being an ice wall hiding thousands of fertile miles of land, lizard people, and the Catholic Church being absolutely the worst organization ever. Why does each of these, even from secular sources, seem to be based in Gnosticism and a very fundamentalist or literalist reading of the scriptures of world religions?
Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate the question. So the similarity that you find to Gnosticism is absolutely correct. The one thing that I would challenge is the idea that they are somehow based on or dependent on Gnosticism textually. I don't think that's necessarily true. I think that Gnosticism and many modern conspiracy theories are in a sort of family resemblance, and you can find types of religious expression repeated in different religious communities that have no historical connection. So you can find similarities between Buddhism and something in I won't say it. I don't know if I'm not going to offend people by drawing comparisons. But just imagine you've got two completely disparate religious communities with no historical connection can still evidence similar traits because they emerge from human beings, which are biologically and spiritually similar, and in similar social contexts. But with this issue, with conspiracy theories and Gnosticism, what you have in common is generally someone or some community that feels marginalized. You have their relationship to a larger society from which they feel alienated, one that they distrust, and one that they're insecure about being alienated from. And what the Gnostic hypothesis or the conspiracy theory does is it gives the individual who feels insecure about their relationship to the wider world a kind of lever that promises to unfold all the secrets of the universe and to explain all the facts of reality and all the reasons why there are so many injustices in the world and why your people have been put down. And therefore that sense of certainty, and there's usually a kind of solid logic behind it. Just grant that, the Catholic Church is made up of lizard people and everything else follows, right? But there's usually a fanciful, fantastical hypothesis at the beginning, and quite a lot of creativity and brilliance into working that hypothesis into an intellectual system that purports to explain all of reality. Conspiracy theories do this in really far-fetched ways that typically involve conspiracies, people meeting in dark rooms with alien powers. But ideologies work the same way. They just tend to be a little bit more grounded in sort of the empirical world and depend less on the idea of a conspiracy or aliens. But they also purport to give a comprehensive explanation for reality and usually a social prescription to cure what ails us, provided that you grant these few hypotheses. And I think what creates a tendency to that is, first of all, everybody has a natural discomfort with uncertainty, and we crave certainty about things. And so the conspiracy theory or the ideologue has a surefire explanation for the way things work. And that's just naturally appealing to us. We're not comfortable with uncertainty. Secondly, it appeals to a person who feels alienated from the wider culture, and they are probably insecure about it. And this gives them a sense of power and importance, a sense of being among the elite or the Illuminati or the elect, what have you. And so the fact that, they weren't the president of our high school class or the head CEO of the corporation, they can console themselves in the knowledge that, yes, but all those benighted souls are trapped by the lizard people, and I alone know the truth. And I think that's just a perennial part of human psychology, and so we find versions of that reappearing down through the centuries. Now, Gnosticism did have a tremendous cultural impact, and so that it would also have reverberations that might not be direct, but indirect throughout culture stands to reason. And I think it's woven into a lot of the fiction that we consume and the narrative and the storytelling. My favorite modern Gnostic myth is probably the movie The Matrix, which is all about, being in the grip of an alien power that's pulled the wool over your eyes, and one guy comes with the secret truth and draws you out of that and so forth. Great fiction, bad philosophy.
Yeah, whenever I'm thinking of lizard people, I'm thinking of all those science fiction movies from the 50s, where they're like 50 feet tall. And...
Yes. Do you remember the Sleestaks from Land of the Lost?
No.
You don't remember Land of the Lost?
No.
Oh, well, they were lizard people.
Well, clearly I have homework to do between now and tomorrow. Thanks so much for your question there, Jaime. We appreciate hearing from you. Henry is in Kansas City, Kansas, listening on YouTube this afternoon. Henry, what's on your mind today, sir?
Hi there. A few parts to this question, all about the same thing. Has Christ's prayer in John 17, that we be one, not yet come to pass? Can it ever come to pass this side of heaven? And is it possible that the unity among believers that he wished for is simply a unity in the Holy Spirit, sort of the way he and the Father are united in the Spirit, and so his prayer did come true, maybe as we'd expect it to?
Okay.
Sure. Thanks so much. I appreciate the question. So the presumption for the first 1,500 years of Christian history, maybe more of that, maybe like the first 1,800 years, was that the unity that Christ desires would be very much a visible, organizational, hierarchical unity, right? And that would mean that everybody joins the church, and that's visibly, demonstrably true.
Yeah.
Then with the advent of denominationalism in the 18th century, a move towards, the idea that, Jesus really wants a kind of spiritual unity, all true believers, regardless of their form of outward organization, and that sort of came to predominate. And I think that there's something to be said for each point of view. Within the context of the verse, Jesus himself says that this will be a unity that will be visible to the world. That the purpose of Christ's prayer for unity is that the world can know that Jesus is the Messiah. So it can't just be reducible to something interior to the human person, something that's an ineffable spiritual quality, but that the world wouldn't know that, right? And the sort of denominational differences are a scandal, and an occasion of, all kinds of problems that do in fact impede people from coming to the truth of the faith. So I do think that it has to include some kind of visible manifestation. On the other hand, I'm sensitive to the charge that, look, just because the entire world is filled with card-carrying Catholics, that might be a good thing from one point of view, but it's not going to solve the fundamental problem of human disunity, because, hey, Catholics can get at one another's throats and fight about the most trivial things and cause all kinds of scandals.
Yeah.
So I really think it's kind of a both and. And in terms of, has it happened, will it happen, how will it happen, what will it look like, I have no idea, to be honest with you. I trust that it will happen as God wants it to happen, or has happened, or is happening, or will come to pass. But it surely escapes my capacity to imagine.
Henry, thanks so much for your call from Kansas City, and he is on the Kansas side. We're trying to keep score. Do we get more calls from the Missouri side or the Kansas side? So here's one for the Kansas side. Here's an email we received from Matthew. Hi, Mr. Price and Dr. Anders. My sister, who is a baptized Catholic, fell out of the Catholic faith several years ago and is now getting married this upcoming Friday evening in a non-religious, secular ceremony. A while ago, my brother emailed our pastor asking whether we're allowed to attend the wedding or not. My brother's still waiting on our pastor's reply. My brother has indicated he will not attend the wedding if he doesn't receive an approval from our pastor by the day of the wedding. The wedding is not a same-sex wedding, and neither my sister or her fiancé have been married before. Do you have any advice for me and my family on what to do in this situation? Thanks for all you do. Love your show. God bless, Matthew.
Yeah, thanks, Matthew. So to begin with, I will never tell, well, I won't say never. I will not usually tell a Catholic to disobey the pastoral counsel of their own pastor. And I don't ever want to get in the middle of that relationship, unless, of course, the pastor tells you to do something just manifestly stupid and idiotic, which, can happen. And the Pope himself would have you obey your conscience rather than the Pope, if the Pope ever demanded that you do something absurd. But under normal circumstances, when it's a matter of prudential judgment, and there's not some, he's not telling you something manifestly horrible, I would never want to interfere in the relationship between a parishioner and a pastor, and certainly would not want to interfere between a person's relationship with their own conscience.
Yeah.
So the most important principle is you do follow pastoral advice and do follow your conscience. And I have had people call my show with this very question and say, look, I am persuaded in my conscience that I cannot do this. Then I say, well, then you cannot do this.
Yeah.
That's just plain as day. You cannot violate your conscience, period, end of paragraph. What would I do in your situation? Different question, and hard to say because these things are always context laden. This is not a valid wedding from the church's point of view because this person is canonically Catholic. They're obligated to be married in the Catholic Church. They're not doing that. It's not a valid wedding. From my point of view, the complication is that the person who's contracting this marriage no longer acknowledges the Catholic Church and has rejected their Catholic identity. Now, they haven't stopped being Catholic canonically, but they certainly have no identification with the Church. And it is questionable, I'm not certain about this, that the response, I can't attend your wedding because it's not canonically valid, that response would even be intelligible to such a person. And so the reason that you would refrain from going is that you don't want to cause scandal. You don't want to seem to approve of what is not valid. But if if the message that you're sending is completely misunderstood and misconstrued, you also have a danger of scandal in the other direction, that this would be perceived as the church being needlessly nitpicking over a matter of just canonical red tape with no substance to it. That's the way a non-Catholic person would tend to view this. And without a really careful explanation, could end up doing more harm than good in terms of the long-term viability of the relationship is concerned. And so no question that it's an invalid marriage. Whether or not you attend, in my judgment, is kind of a prudential judgment based on the circumstances of the case and your relationship with the person in question and what you can and cannot effectively communicate.
Appreciate that. Matthew, thank you so much for your email. It's Called to Communion here on EWTN. We have time to get to a few more calls here at 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. As they say, last call for your call, 833-288-EWTN. Be sure to join us for Cresta in the Afternoon coming up a little later on today at 4 p.m. Eastern. Today, Al invites Dr. Francis Beckwith on to discuss natural law, natural theology, and the Protestant critique. Are we really that far apart? Always a great show with Al Cresta. Cresta in the Afternoon today at 4 p.m. Eastern on most of these EWTN radio stations. Let's go now to John in Greenville, South Carolina, listening to Catholic Radio in South Carolina. John, what's on your mind today, sir?
From reading Dr. Anders' bio, I determined that we both attended the same postgraduate divinity school. He went on to mature to Roman Catholicism, and I went on to join a traditional Anglican church. I didn't complete that school in Deerfield, but I did attend different decade, and I just wanted to call and comment. I so much appreciate the show and what you do every day, and especially the pro-life point of view of the Roman Catholic Church, which is ours as well.
I really profoundly appreciate that, and you refrained from naming the divinity school. I don't mind naming it. I went to Trinity Evangelical Divinity School in Deerfield, Illinois, and I'm very intensely grateful for the experience. I learned an awful lot about the Bible there. I learned an awful lot about church history, and honestly, I would not be a Catholic today, but for my experience at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, which is and now called Trinity University, I think. And one of the reasons why is that my professors were very anti-Catholic, and they were very careful to explain the important critical differences between Catholicism and traditional Protestantism. And they said, look, here are the line in the sand issues. And if you come down on this side of the line, you're a Catholic. And if you come down on this side of the line, you're a Protestant. And there's no middle ground on these issues. And the big one, the biggie, was the idea of the imputation of Christ's righteousness. This is sort of the key principle in Luther's doctrine of justification by faith alone. And they said, look, if you fiddle around with imputation, if you get rid of imputation, your Protestantism is done. You're Catholic at that point. And when I heard that message, I was, oh yeah, great, Catholics are wrong, evangelicals, woo, yay us, up with us, you know. And then I went to PhD studies, and I spent an awful lot of time digging around in the Church Fathers, especially Augustine, and I realized that man was a Catholic by their definition. He was just as Catholic as the day was long, as were the other fathers of the Church. And in fact, that everybody I could lay my hands on held the Catholic view on salvation up until Martin Luther. And then I found Protestant scholars like Alistair McGrath that said the same thing, that Luther's position was a theological novelty. And I went and sort of revisited St. Paul again. I went back and studied Paul in light of some of the best Pauline scholarship by Protestant scholars, men like N.T. Wright or Christopher Stendhal or James Dunn, and found out, lo and behold, they didn't hold the Lutheran position on justification either. And so I remembered the lessons I had learned at Trinity, that if you wiggle out of imputation, well, that there goes Protestantism down the tubes. And that really began my move to the Catholic Church. And I don't know that I would have gotten there but for the formation I got at Trinity. And I had, they believed what they believed, and they were men and women of, sincerity and goodwill, and some of them outstanding researchers and scholars, and I was very grateful for the experience. And I had friends that went Anglican and some that went Catholic, and there's probably a few floating out there that have gone Orthodox, and it was a great time of my life.
John, thanks so much for your call and for your kind words about the show. We really do appreciate that. It's Called to Communion here on EWTN. Let's go to Laura in Jackson, Michigan, listening on Sirius XM channel 130. Laura, what's on your mind today?
Okay, so hello.
Hi.
It's a little bit of a doozy. So background story real fast. I was baptized Lutheran. My husband was baptized Catholic. He was raised Catholic up until about 7th grade, 8th grade. Then his parents got divorced. He went with his mother to the Lutheran church. We've been married 9 years. We've got 3 children. But we wanted to renew our vows after my husband had started going back to the Catholic Church. He's been going about roughly 4 to 5 months now. I just started going with him, but we had just found out that they don't recognize our marriage in the Catholic Church, even though we were married Lutheran, in a Lutheran church. And I guess it has to do with not getting permission, and I'm just trying to understand why.
Okay, I totally understand, and your bafflement and confusion, and you're hurt and offended by it as well, and I really absolutely understand. And from your point of view, this is just kind of a 1-2 punch, and I really apologize in advance for the shock and probably the offense and horror that with which you've greeted this news. And so I want you to know I'm really sympathetic, and I think that your position of befuddlement is quite understandable. So let me try to make sense for you. And let me also assuage your conscience that from the Catholic Church's point of view, you are not a bad person. Like, the Church doesn't think you're somehow evil or bad or wicked or you've done something wrong. And I trust that you have done everything that you've done following your conscience and in good faith. And I would never presume to say that, God judges you harshly in this. I would not ever say that. I don't think that at all. So please don't think that I'm saying that or the Church is saying that. But here's what the Church does think. Unlike Lutherans, and Luther was pretty clear on this, there's a very clear difference between Catholics and Lutherans. Luther thought that there were basically 2 sacraments, the sacrament of the altar, the Lord's Supper, Holy Communion on the one hand, and then baptism. Catholic Church thinks there's a lot more sacraments. There's 7 of them, and one of them is marriage. Now, Luther did not think marriage was a sacrament. He thought it was a good and right and holy thing. He thought God instituted marriage. He thought marriage was fantastic. People ought to get married. It's a divine institution, but he didn't think it was a sacrament. And here's the difference, all right? So for a sacrament in Catholic understanding is a rite instituted by Jesus that is a sign or a symbol that contains the mystery that it signifies. And so there's a real grace attached to a sacrament that is absent from, say, just a public institution. So government is a public institution, but it's not a sacrament, and there's no divine grace attached to it. And the way Luther and the Reformers thought about marriage is they said it's a public institution, like government is a public institution. It's a good one, but it's not a sacrament. And so there's no specific Christian grace attached to that as a sacrament. And as such, it ought not to be regulated by the Church. It's a civil institution. It ought to be regulated by the state. And that was a big deal in the Reformation and continues to be a big deal with Protestants today, that this is, it's a public institution, it's a civil institution ordered to the common good of society, and it can be regulated by the state. And in fact, they were pretty adamant, the Reformers, Luther and Calvin, that the Catholic Church ought not to regulate marriage. Now, here's the Church's position. If you're not a Catholic, in fact, if you're not a Christian, we think the Protestant view on marriage is correct. If you're not a Catholic, if you're not a Christian, the marriage of 2 Hindus, the marriage of 2 Buddhists, the marriage of 2 atheists is a civil institution, rightly and appropriately regulated by the state. But when you have the marriage of 2 baptized people, now you have something different. Now you have a sacrament. A Christian marriage is a sacrament. And as a sacrament, it falls within the jurisdiction of the Church. And so who does the wedding matters. And it would be kind of like this. I know Lutherans think of ordination differently from Catholics, but you ordain your ministers, okay? Where do you ordain them? You ordain them in the church. You have baptisms. You do think those are sacraments. Where do you do it? You do it in the church. What would you think if a Lutheran minister said, I'd like to be ordained at the top of Space Mountain, the roller coaster at Disney World? You'd say, dude, that's just inappropriate. That's the wrong context for this thing that we think is sacred.
Yeah.
I'd like to get baptized at Buc-ee's. I just made Tom Price spit out his tea.
Wow.
You're like, Buc-ee's is a fine institution, but wrong context for a baptism.
Yeah.
Let's do it in a sacred space. And so the Catholic Church says, look, it's a Catholic sacrament. It ought to take place, unless there are major, considerations that need to be taken into account. it'll be taking place in a Catholic church. And so there's actually a law of the church that says that. Now, you can be dispensed from the law. You can make other arrangements with permission, but if you don't do that, then it's what we call lacking canonical form. And so, look, fixing it is no big deal. It's very easy to do. There's two ways to do this. One of them is you just go say your vows again in front of a Catholic priest. And then the church says, okay, valid. We're done. Good. Now, there are some Protestant spouses that say, look, I find this whole thing so insulting that I'm not going to do that. I refuse to go say my vows in front of a Catholic priest because I'm not Catholic and I don't have to do that. Fine. There's a way for you forward in that case also. Big technical fat word here. It's called ratiocination. Don't worry about what it means. Ratiocination is a way that the church declares a marriage to be valid when you have a Catholic spouse and a non-Catholic spouse, and they want to be married and they want to stay married, but the non-Catholic spouse says, I don't want to go say my vows in front of a priest. You can appeal for something called a ratiocination, and all it is the church acknowledging, okay, you guys are really married now in the eyes of the church. But it boils down to this conception of sacramentality, that the sacraments are part of the church's jurisdiction, that the church really does have the right to regulate marriage and all the sacraments, and the fact that it didn't follow canonical form. But it shouldn't be taken as a judgment about you as a person. This is a legal ruling, not a personal judgment.
Very good. Laura, thank you so much for your call. Let's go to Leslie in Utah, listening on Sirius XM, Channel 130. Leslie, what's on your mind today?
Oh, yes. Thank you for taking my call. I heard Dr. Anders explaining to a gentleman a bit ago about the Eucharist and the body, blood, soul, and divinity, that Christ is there, but not physically, that whole discussion. I'm wondering how this squares with Luke 24:39, where Christ says that he is not, my Bible says spirit, I guess yours says ghost, because a ghost doesn't have body and bones as you see that I do. Now, it seems to me that if he were trying to convince them that he was really him, and he wasn't some kind of ghost or evil spirit or something, he would have included in his explanation that I am as I was before, with body, bones, and blood. But he didn't say that.
Okay, yeah, thanks. So first of all, at least in terms of Luke 24, when this is after the resurrection, when Jesus appears to his disciples, and he says, look, I've got flesh and blood, you can tell I'm not a ghost. His purpose there was to demonstrate the truth of the resurrection. But the Catholic position on the Eucharist is, first of all, that he does have bones and blood and tendons and flesh, as it were, in the Eucharist, but substantially. We don't have the appearance of them, but the reality is there in the Eucharist. It really is Christ's body, blood, soul, and divinity that's present in the Eucharist. But his purpose in giving himself to us in this form is not to manifest by empirical signs the truth of his resurrection. Right? That's what he was trying to do in Luke 24. Here we have something different in view, and it is a presence of Christ that is only accessible by faith. We can only know it's there because Christ told us he's there in that manner.
Leslie, thank you so much. I'm glad we could get you in at the very tail end of the show. We could not get to Claudia in Dallas. We wanted to, but you know what? Here comes the music and just could not do it. Claudia, please call us back tomorrow. We will put you on at the head of the line. Also, we couldn't get to a couple of great questions from Hoss on YouTube and one from Chris. We'll do those at the beginning of tomorrow's program. Dr. David Anders, thank you, sir.
Thanks, Tom.
We do this program Monday through Friday, 2 p.m. Eastern, right here on EWTN Radio, with an encore at 11 p.m. Eastern, 8 p.m. on the West Coast. On behalf of our fantastic team, I'm Tom Price. Glad to be back with Dr. David Anders. Glad to be back with you tomorrow at the same time. See you then. God bless.
He is honored by the Church as a Franciscan saint and one of the greatest preachers in church history.
Matthew Bunson and the Doctors of the Church.
Portuguese-born Anthony of Padua entered the Franciscans in 1220 and soon displayed a genius for preaching. He was sent to preach against the heretics in Italy and France and was chosen by Francis of Assisi himself as the first professor of theology for the Franciscans. He died in 1231 and was